Well, good afternoon, everyone. And for those of you who tuned in for the live transmission, apologies for the gremlins and glitches that happened somewhere between Berlin and New York. Today is April 15th of 2022, Good Friday, Passover, Ramadan. I wish people everywhere around the world peace, especially in Ukraine, love, music, and fellowship of all kinds. And my version of this fellowship is a program called Fred Plotkin on Fridays that I do on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. My guest today is joining me from Boston is Randall Scotting, whose work I have admired, but we've never met. We've never really conversed, apart from a couple of emails. So I will get right to the point and welcome him. Randall is a countertenor. Randall, what is a countertenor?
Yeah, it's complicated because there's a lot of sort of little subcategories within that term. But what I usually say is just that it's the highest male voice part. And I just leave it at that. Then there's other things we could talk about. There's sopranists, and but within that range also, what I guess people don't always understand is that there are really these different types of voices. So I'm more of like a fuller, lower mezzo kind of voice. I can sing high notes, but I don't sit up there. And then there's other guys who just love to sit up in the stratosphere. So within the umbrella of countertenor, there's quite a variation of voices as well, just like with sopranos or mezzo sopranos.
Many countertenors sing two distinct repertories and basically missed the 19th and early 20th century of opera. You sing music from the Baroque era and from the beginnings of opera, and you sing contemporary opera, often with roles written specifically for countertenor voices. Um, what is it like not singing in the big Verdis and Wagners and so on? And do you ever picture doing that and maybe a role intended for soprano, like the Forest Bird and Siegfried?
Oh, there's things like Wagner almost wrote a part for castrato, which is something that we could now inhabit, but it didn't end up happening. There's roles like Carabino that countertenors do now. I used to think I'd love to sing Baba the Turk. I just thought
Mm-hmm.
that would be amazing and add
In
another
Greg's
kind of,
Progress by
yeah,
Stravinsky. Yep.
yeah, add
You
another
already have
level
the
to the whole
beard.
thing.
The
Yeah.
character has to have a beard. So
um, but the place that we get to do all of that music from the middle, is in concert. So we can sing song cycles, and I mean I'm not going to get to sing Visi d'arte probably or Turandot, but which of course I would love to. The visceral feeling of just making that sound I think would be very satisfying, but that's just not something that is in my physical makeup as a countertenor. But I'm very happy also on the bookends, the contemporary and the Baroque. There's plenty to explore there.
because you say that there are different kinds of countertenor voices, let's explore that somewhat. Because I've been friends and I've worked with other countertenors, and I can tell you that they have very distinct sounds and personalities, and it's not interchangeable at all. But it's not something I've ever discussed publicly with an artist before. So talk about the different kinds of countertenor voices and what they may be more adapted to singing for.
Sure. Well, there's two kind of main schools of countertenor singing, I think, that have evolved. One is coming out of the choral tradition in England and tends to be a bit of a leaner sound, maybe more kind of not straight tone exactly, but with an awareness towards tuning in a choral setting. That's the way that those guys approach the voice. And it's wonderfully articulate and clear. There's benefits to sort of both types of voices, but that's one big group. And then the other big group is more what I think you could deem an American tradition, which is kind of a fuller bodied sound, vibrato, more drama in the sound. And for me, that kind of voice is more suited to opera because it matches it matches the colleagues that you're singing with on stage, you know, a soprano or a tenor. It's more that quality. So it doesn't stand out for me as much. But this other kind, this sort of pure, more British style, choral style, I love that type of voice for sacred music, for Bach. So there's just the benefits of both. But I think you can definitely hear that when you listen to different countertenors, the sort of school of training that they came from and how they imagine the sound.
So I'm digging into my very distant memory. Was his name Alfred or Albert Deller? A
Alfred,
British
yeah.
Alfred
He's the
Deller,
the
who,
granddaddy of us all in modern days. Yeah.
and because I am older than I look, and because I was taken to performances when I was very young, I actually heard him sing in New York.
Wow.
And I had no
Lucky.
concept of what that was about because as a 6 and 7 year old, I didn't have anything comparative to make. It didn't
Mhm.
seem strange for me that the sound was very high
Yeah.
because I had no expectation that it'd be otherwise. But when you say that he was the granddaddy, talk about his role in countertenorism. I will say, by the way, that when I was preparing this conversation with you, I entered in my computer countertenor and it was corrected to counterterrorism.
Yeah, that happens a lot on my spell check when I'm texting. Counter terror, yeah. Unrelated. Yeah, Alfred Deller. So he was in England, I believe, sort of early 70s. Does that sound right? And he did a bunch of research to basically bring back the countertenor voice. He's the one that Benjamin Britten wrote A Midsummer Night's Dream for. Originally, he premiered it. And it just, he was the one, he founded an ensemble, the Deller Consort, which toured all over the world. You know, as you mentioned, you saw him in New York. And they brought back a lot of music from the Renaissance, things like Morley and Laws, that they had viols that played with them, so it was a whole group. And some of it was,
Viols Vials.
yes,
Yeah,
some of
okay.
it was like lightly choral, you know, several parts, but then there were also solo things, and he brought back a lot of Purcell, and you know, as I mentioned, dipped into opera and had pieces written for him. Just the uniqueness of his voice, it was a very special quality. And his son also was a countertenor. There's recordings of them singing Purcell duets together, and he just sort of had, he brought awareness to it with all the touring that he did and the performing and the recording, and then it sort of took off from there, and then people realized that this is something that they could do, I think, operatically singing as a
When it
countertenor.
was in effect rediscovered,
Mhm.
countertenorism, um, how did pedagogy start and how did people start learning how to teach it? And then how did gentlemen such as yourself and your colleagues learn how to do it? I will say that I, in the past, have worked with David Daniels, who is,
Uh-huh.
if if Deller was the grandfather, then David Daniels is probably the father or the son, let's say, and you are among the grandchildren.
I'm flattered that you would say that. Yeah.
Well, it's true.
Yeah, so Deller definitely came out of this choral tradition. So his voice had that kind of quality, a little bit straighter, leaner sound. And I think that he trained technically that way as a choral singer, and then just sort of made the leap into opera. And so that's how I guess it would have started technically if we're speaking about the actual training of the voice. But then over time, I think people started to realize that you can do more. You can strengthen the voice in a way that you can actually sing more dramatically, or and then that's where David came along. And David was, you know, very influential to me when I was younger, because I heard for the first time this sort of warmth and musicality which I didn't hear in some of his predecessors. And I mean, there were some, definitely, singers like Drew Minter and Jeffrey Gall, and they were there, but
Mhm.
David sort of popularized it and also brought this vulnerability, and you felt that you were connecting with him through the way he was singing. There was such a presence there, just listening to him. And I would say that I didn't emulate that, but what it did for me was it showed me that I could sing the way I naturally wanted to sing. I didn't have to model myself after these other performers, because that's what a countertenor is. You know, David sort of showed that you can have this more approachable, musical, full-bodied connected kind of sound, which is what I naturally felt my voice was. And so then I felt I had permission to kind of be that, and not have to fit myself into some mold that didn't feel right for me.
Well, I remember very well the first time I heard David Daniels sing and then got to know him and heard him and everything. People in the audience, whether they were friendly to the concept of the countertenor or was alien to them, whatever, would swoon from the beauty of his singing. And
It's
for listeners, I want people to understand a singer can have a beautiful voice or an average voice, but can also be a fantastic singer or a mediocre singer.
mhm,
And when we're very lucky, we get someone like a David Daniels who has a gorgeous voice and is a magnificent singer.
mhm.
And Marilyn Horne is another. There are Samuel Ramey. There are people like this who are have been given fantastic voices and are just amazing singers.
Yeah.
Um, there's something else that you have in common with David Daniels that I think is worth noting on the stage.
Mhm.
Namely, many countertenors are slight of frame,
Oh yeah.
and David is a solid man. He's not heavy, but he is a solid, robust-looking man. And you, I discovered, are 6'3", which is 191 centimeters. And David, it's not out of school to say this, I remember would often roll up his sleeves with his costumes as I'm doing now. He has very hairy arms and he has sort of a hairy chest. And he didn't do this for vanity, but because he often played heroes.
Mhm.
And when you'd see the hairy arms and the hairy chest, it created an entirely different kind of stage personality for the character. I don't
Mhm.
mean for David Daniels, but for the person that he was playing. If he was playing a king or a military leader or such, he could do that. You, because of your height and you have a beard and so on, can also present that on the stage and
Yeah,
play heroes.
yeah, I think that's my bread and butter. That's where I belong. Vocally, it's a bigger sound, and that matched with the physique. I think I can be very believable as what you might expect of a hero, sort of in a modern way, kind of cinematically. I guess we're used to that, like what you see on screen. In the Baroque, when the castrati were doing this, of course, that was a whole separate thing, and there was this suspension of disbelief and this idea that seeing these sort of unusual musical creatures performing these roles had an alluring quality about it. That's separate, and I think, but now we expect this sort of realism, or we can have this realism, and I think that's what I can bring to these roles, this sort of strength and virility.
For someone listening who may not be completely familiar with the differences that you and I understand very well between a countertenor and a castrato,
Oh yeah,
what
sure.
one has and the other doesn't, and so forth. Would you explain in a sort of medical clinical way what happens, but also not only what happened to the poor fellow who lost certain things, but also sound production, the development of the diaphragm, and everything related to the singing?
Yeah, sure. Now you're getting into my field. I've done tons of research on this. I have a PhD in 18th century Italian opera, so I can go on for days. Just, tell me to push pause if I've said enough. But basically, in the 1600s and 1700s was the heyday. If a young boy showed promise vocally, and he would start training, and usually in his choir, where at his church down the street, and if the choir master there felt that he had some promise, they might send him on to have an operation, which would alter and cause him not to go through puberty, not to develop. They would castrate him, they remove his testicles. And that would happen anytime from around 7 years up until about 13. And then they would continue to train in their church choir. And then, if things went well and they actually had a voice, which was still a question, no one knew for sure if this person would evolve into being a fine singer. But if that happened, then they would transition and debut singing on the stage, singing in operas. sometimes performing as women, because in Catholic states that was common. Men weren't allowed, especially in Rome, to be performing on stage. So all of the roles were done by castrati in the female roles, and then
Men were
sometimes you'd
not,
have
or
a
women were
tenor.
not allowed to perform.
Women, sorry, did I say men?
Yes,
Women.
yeah.
So men, the castrati performed as women.
Mhm.
And that's a practice where they learned how to develop their skill on stage. And then eventually they would evolve into performing the heroic roles, which some of them would become, huge superstars performing all over Europe doing those parts. So that's kind of the tradition, the performing tradition of the castrati. And that's what the modern countertenor, when we strengthen the technique and can actually perform this music, can step into. And it's some of the most technically demanding music I think you can possibly perform. The feats of coloratura were just sometimes out of this world, what the composers demanded of these singers. And but also the lyrical singing, it has its own virtuosic challenges. And in one evening in a Baroque opera, these castrati would have been expected to show all of these strengths that they had throughout the course of the night. So, and the audience expected that. So it wasn't just show up and sing one fiery aria and that was it. It was show all these sides of your artistic personality and your musicality to the audience. So that's the tradition that we inhabit.
So now let's go to the musical page. In the 18th century, a lot of times composers would put down the melodic line. Let's think of Handel, but it could be many others.
Mhm.
And then all kinds of interpolations and individual performances would happen between the notes, within the notes, between the words. If a singer was singing amore, amore, si, 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 the lyrics were minimal, but it was with the sound that he would use and the fioritura and everything else that would make his performance distinct. That was not all written down. So you in the 21st century, when you're singing music that may have been sung in 1745, how do you make it, I don't want to say authentic because I hate that word, but faithful to in the tradition of what the countertenors may have sung 300 years ago?
The castrati.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that happens all the time. Well, to be faithful to those, that music and that style of performing, there's a lot of research that has to go into it. We need to read what people had to say at the time about ornamentation, for example, and not only that, but style. These expectations of how to inhabit the music and how to bring your personality to it. There are treatises that are out there, and quite a few of them. For example, one from 1723 outlines different types of trills, and there were 6 different types of trills that a Baroque singer would have expected to know how to employ. So there was a lot of training, not only the musical training, but also language and delivery and rhetoric and poetry. So that's a training that I think is lost now in our modern age, that these castrati would have had from a very young age. They would have studied all of that every day, and they were very aware of literary devices and poetry and rhyming schemes and all of that. So that then influences how you deliver a recitative in this style when it's composed with 9 syllables or 11 syllable lines or 7 syllables. They would have been aware of all of that and where the rhymes came, it's just hard now to have that depth of knowledge about all of the aspects that we would have that a castrato would have brought to his music making. But yeah, and it became then a very individual thing, the way that they would deliver this text, the way that they would choose to ornament, going up to the top of their range or the bottom, whether they would hold a note, do a messa di voce, and then if that was a particular strength of theirs, they'd throw those in all over the place. And also it should
Define
be,
messa di voce.
right, sorry, it's when you
Placement
start
of the voice.
start
Yeah.
very soft,
Yeah.
crescendo to a very loud dynamic, and then decrescendo back down to nothing. And it's a very, very challenging ornament.
Mhm.
And so it was the height of this sort of training and virtuosity if you could do that well. But I also should mention too that these castrati, they varied things. It wasn't the same every night. They would ornament differently. They would bring different dramatic interpretations night to night, because people were going to see the same opera, which would run sometimes 16 performances if it sold well, sometimes more. And the same people would go back because going to the opera was the thing to do. It was the night out. And so they'd go and see the same show again and again and again. And it was up to the performers to bring different nuance every night to it, which they were very able to do.
I want to tell listeners a little bit more about Italy at the time of the castrati, that Italy was not yet a nation. It was a series of city-states, and much of it was under foreign occupation. Rome, as you said, was under the Vatican, but the most important operatic city in not only Italy, but Europe in the 18th century was Naples for most of the time. And Venice had been important the century before, and certainly was, and Milan would grow, and Bologna and others, and certainly Venice and Paris, I'm sorry, Vienna and Paris, and especially London, because Handel had been to Venice in the first decade of the 18th century and learned the Venetian operatic style, and went to London, introduced opera and oratorio in English and opera in Italian to London, and imported many of the finest Italian singers, including castrati, from Italy. The reason that there were so many castrati in Naples was not just the musical tradition, but because Naples, though a great city and a gorgeous city, also had a lot of poverty. And there were often orphans who were taken in by the church. And if they were in choirs and demonstrated talent, the church would see to their being castrated, unfortunately, and keep them in choirs. And then they would grow up and become handsome Neapolitan guys and sing beautifully and become not just great musicians, but great sex symbols around Europe. And what was especially appealing about many countertenors from, these good-looking guys from Naples and elsewhere in Italy was a woman could sleep with him and not become pregnant.
Right.
And so they became great
Castrati.
objects. Castrati, did
Yeah.
Okay, yes. You can become pregnant by a countertenor. You cannot become pregnant by a castrato. And
that's the difference, yeah.
That's a nice way to put it.
Simple.
And if men wanted to sleep with these guys, they also were often, some of them, available for that. And they became these sexual superstars and great dramatic people who were seen on the stage and would attract crowds and so on, and live very well. And the King of Spain, I'm forgetting his name suddenly, invited Farinelli to come to his court, not as a sexual partner, but as someone to inspire him and lift his mood. And Farinelli lived at the court for many years. Senesino was another one. He was originally from Siena, hence the name Senesino, but thrived all over Europe. And there were all these great characters. They are characters, in addition to being great artists who I know you've studied. Now, on Adagio, it is possible to listen to you, and I hope people will, in the oratorio by Antonio Caldara, Santo Stefano Primo Re di Ungheria. It's an oratorio. I knew very little about Caldara, so I listened to your wonderful recording. You played the title role of Stephen, the first king of Hungary. Caldara, he was born in Venice in 1617, died in Vienna in 1736. He wrote 78 operas, 20 masses, 38 oratorios. And so now I need to do a lot of listening to Caldara, but I can say that based on what I've listened to him in the past few days in preparation for our conversation, I made my own notes and I could be wrong, but I find that he combines the Venetian madrigal tradition represented by Monteverdi more than the operatic tradition, the madrigal tradition, the wonderful melodic ease of Alessandro Scarlatti, and the instrumental expression of Arcangelo Corelli. This is just my impression based on having heard four works. But how did it come to your being asked to record this Caldara? I know that you were a Fulbright in Hungary.
Mhm.
We're going to talk about being a Fulbright in a bit. But and Hungarian, which is the Hungarian great recording house, recorded this. But how was it this? I guess because Saint Stephen was the first king of Hungary, it
Right.
had local interest. But talk about
Yes.
how this project happened.
So, as you mentioned, I was doing a Fulbright in Budapest. I ended up being there for 3 years in total. I did 1 year as a Fulbright, and then I just stayed. I loved it there, and it became my home base while I was singing in Germany and other places. And I would always come back to Budapest. I was working with the dramatic soprano Eva Marton when I was there.
Oh my goodness!
So yeah, that's unusual as a countertenor. Uh,
Wow.
Yes, and I learned quite a lot from her. I would say she was a wonderful vocal coach for me. She knew some of the repertoire. She sung and recorded Handel. It's not the things people go to and want to hear her sing, but she did do it. And she knows, of course, things like Gluck, the more popular things in the repertoire. But if I would bring obscure things to her, we would then work on aspects of interpretation, and she didn't know the history of all of it, but she knew how to present to an audience, and those are the kinds of things she
Does she
taught
ever?
me.
Yeah.
Yeah, one time I was working with her, and I sang Che farò, the Orfeo aria by
Fail.
Gluck, and she wanted me to do it a certain way, and she said, no, like this, and she demonstrated, sang the phrase, and she goes, look, I give myself to goose flesh. Like she had made herself, it's just so amazing. Just do it like
In
that,
what
do it the
language
way
did
she
you
does it.
work with her?
In what? Sorry?
In what language did you work with her?
That was another thing. She spoke broken English pretty
Yeah.
well. So we'd start there. And then if there were, we weren't understanding, then we'd go to German. And then if that was not working, then we'd go to Italian. And then the last would be Hungarian, because after I'd been there for a while, I definitely understood. I didn't really study the language, but I picked up a lot of it. So, and then, through that course of languages, we'd always get to the point that we were trying to work on.
She taught me the most important Hungarian word I learned.
Okay, is it
Fugyulos.
naughty?
Ice
Say
cream.
it.
Fugyulos.
Oh,
Ice cream.
okay.
Fugyulos.
Okay. Yeah.
All right.
Oh,
So
so
you
no,
and
wait.
I
So then,
sometime will have to open a bottle of Egri Bikaver with the bull's blood wine
and
and
some
have a
palinka.
Eva Marton
Yes,
conversation, not to be
love
recorded.
to.
But
Love
I
to.
can say that I had the great privilege and honor of working with her a lot
Uh-huh.
in the Shank of her Met career. Um, Lohengrin, La Gioconda, Tosca. I could write a book just about my experiences with Eva
Right.
Marton. All wonderful, but she's a very vivid, present performer.
Oh
And
yeah.
when she arrived in New York, she really didn't speak any English, and she and I spoke in Italian. And she gradually did learn some English, but was always more comfortable in other languages. The last thing we did together was her famous production of Turandot with Zeffirelli.
Oh.
And it was just, she was an astonishing performer, Electra, Salome,
Mhm.
because she knows how to bring it to the stage. And I don't mean overacting ever, but a total artistic commitment.
Yeah.
She could be rather serious and cross. She's about your height practically,
Mhm.
and a big presence on the stage. She does not suffer fools gladly at
No,
all,
no, no.
but she, on the other hand, she makes opera work.
Yeah, I think we always got along when I was working with her. Everyone, I tell them that I worked with her, and they're shocked that we worked well together, because she
Oh
is such
no,
a
yeah,
strong personality.
yeah.
But I was always on the same page as her. She'd say something, I'd sing through something and she'd say that wasn't great, and I would know it, and I would agree with her, and I would want to fix it. I think you run into problems when, if I would have been strong and said, no, it was great, I know that it was fantastic, you're the one who's not hearing it correctly or something, that's when you would butt heads. But I always wanted to get better and learn from her. And so she was then, very happy to help me do that. She said one thing that stuck with me, which was that in her whole career, there are probably 5 roles that just fit you like a glove, and that's true of any artist, you know, that psychologically and musically and vocally and everything, it just fits you. And I find that amazing, because how many roles did she sing, you know, and out of all of those, there are 5 that she felt were the ones that she really connected with.
Did she name any of them?
I didn't probe to find out more from her, and
Okay, so
actually
I would say Elsa in
okay,
Lohengrin.
yeah,
I would say Tosca, absolutely.
amazing,
I
yeah.
would say Madalena in Andrea Chenier. I would maybe say Gioconda, maybe, but I don't think Turandot. I
Oh,
mean,
really?
it fit musically, it fit her magnificently.
Yeah.
I don't think that she saw herself as that woman. Tosca
Hmm.
was too cold. Eva Marton is a very hot personality.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the kind of fire that she burns with that is so magnificent in Tosca
Yes,
does not
absolutely.
exist in Turandot.
Yeah, she's removed always,
Yeah.
isn't she? Yeah.
And there's very little physical contact until the very end. And she could sing it, you know, before breakfast, she could sing
Yeah.
Turandot. That's not the
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah.
But I never felt that. I mean, I think another opera that I once heard her do Ballo and Mascara, of all things, and she was very, very committed to that. But she, I mean, just a fantastic artist.
Yeah.
But I'm very
Consummate.
glad to
Yeah.
hear that you worked with her, because frankly, she does have the reputation of being incredibly difficult. I
Yeah.
never found her, well, yes, I occasionally found her difficult, but the thing was that it was for a serious purpose.
Mhm.
So I never minded that she might have been difficult, because
It's
our aims were the same.
it's exactly what you said. She doesn't suffer fools, you know. And if she respects you, and you feel that you're working towards the same goal,
Yeah.
then you get along. Yeah, absolutely. But going back to your question, so
Yeah.
I then was in Budapest as a Fulbright scholar, and I started delving into uh, Baroque rarities, I guess. That's when I really started looking into it. I was singing in Germany as a guest, and I would go back to Budapest, and I was just lonely and had all this mental space because I didn't speak Hungarian. I had removed myself from the US and all these like distractions that had come at me. And so I just found a kind of silence that then opened up space in my mind to be curious again. And I was looking into these roles that Senesino had performed. That's where it really started. And I just had a little spreadsheet, and I filled in all these operas from different sources that I could find out about. And then that evolved over the 3 years that I was in Budapest. And that actually became eventually what I did the PhD on in London, was purely Senesino's repertoire. But it led into other kind of tangents. And one of them was Caldara. And I came across this oratorio and thought that I had to send away to an archive to get microfiche and then go print it off and to see what it was. And it was great. And there was a Baroque group that I had worked a little bit with in Budapest, and he's sort of the guy who ran that group kind of at the same time had gotten onto this piece. And so we connected and then just ended up going from there. And we performed it in Germany. We performed it around Hungary in different festivals, and we recorded it. So that's how that came about.
So I think it was
And
called the Savaria Baroque Orchestra.
yes, yeah,
What
one
does
of
that mean,
2 in
Savaria?
Hungary. Savaria is sort of an old name for that area of the world.
Okay,
Yeah,
never knew
like
that one.
like Bohemia for that part. It's
Savaria,
yeah,
I like the name.
yeah. And actually, then that time period evolved into this. It sort of showed me the pleasure of finding these unknown pieces, and
Mhm.
and then that's become a huge focus of what I do now.
So I was a Fulbright working in opera and in Milan. And let's talk a bit, not about ourselves for a change, but for other people, especially young musicians who aspire to advance their careers, about what the Fulbright program is. And you started, I'll kick in, because I just think it's very important that people know what
Yeah.
that is about.
Absolutely agree. It was a transformative experience for me. So Fulbright, basically the idea is that if you go abroad and experience other cultures, that will bring awareness of other people, and it will open your mind to seeing things in a different way, than what you know in your sort of very small, only American viewpoint of things. And that can only be a positive thing throughout your life. And that's exactly what I think it does. It just exposes you to new things, new people, new ways of thinking and doing things, history from different places in the world, and all of that. And that just then opens your mind to being able to connect a bit more with people, no matter where they come from, having had that experience.
So the name Fulbright is a great name because it sounds like we're all very smart, but it actually was named for Senator Fulbright, who
Hmm.
was from the state of Arkansas, which is a poor state in the South, but he understood that this cultural exchange that can happen can also lead, we hope, to peace and to understanding, so that Fulbright grants were not just to Italy and Hungary and London and so forth, but would be to Ghana. I knew a guy who had a Fulbright in Togo in West Africa. And the great thing about the Fulbright program, among the many, is that it's not just Americans going abroad. It is often the same number of people going to the United States. So that because I was an Italian Fulbright, I've welcomed Fulbrights from Italy to the United States and gotten to know them and sort of shown them the way. And it creates a lifelong cultural exchange. I had mine in 1978, which is a long time ago, but I was very, very young, because typically one has to be a bit older for a Fulbright, but I was unusually young to get one. And because you can get one later in life as a scholar, um, it's something that is, I think, more important than ever. I think that when this awful war finally ends, that we're going to have to send Fulbrights to Russia and to Ukraine, and we're going to have to bring Russians and Ukrainians out to meet in other places and discuss in an open way about the world. And Fulbright is not just the performing arts, not at all. It's history, it's visual arts, it's medicine. I knew a woman who had a Fulbright to Italy, an American in medicine. And it's just an outstanding program that I encourage people to support if they can financially, but also to bring it to the attention of young people and older people all over the world, because often for them it's their way to get to the United States and help understand America better, because I believe you and I are both Americans. We are vastly misunderstood in the world.
Oh yeah.
We are stereotyped, and people, you're closer to what people think of as the American man than I am. You're from out west, am I
Mhm.
correct? And
Colorado,
you're
yeah.
tall and strapping, and if we put you on a horse, and that whole image would fit, and you'd be eating a steak and the whole thing. But
Mhm.
these are all stereotypes. But we are a very complex country with all kinds of people, and we are a product of immigration and growth and collaboration. And that is the best, I think, of the Fulbright program. And you were able to go to Hungary, and people could meet you there and learn about America.
Yeah, and also it works the other way too. Like I think now there are certain ideas about Hungary. Since I was there, things have gotten much more conservative and sort of. But I also know that even though I see that in the news, that's not all Hungarians. I learned that there are that sort of aspect. Just like in the U.S., we have this ultra conservative sort of group. But I would never judge all of those people as a whole in the sort of simple surface aspect of what I'm seeing. I know that there's, through personal connection with people, I know that there's other viewpoints.
And I would point people to Adam and Ivan Fischer, the wonderful conductors,
Mm-hmm.
and to many other Hungarian musicians who bring the best of Hungary and their culture to the world.
So I have a theory about this, which is that life in Hungary is not the easiest. It's a hard place to be. There's not a lot of money. They're still kind of under the shadow of World War II. You walk down the street and you can see some buildings that still are riddled with bullet holes from the revolution in 1959, and the Russian occupation.
56, right?
56,
56?
yeah, okay,
Yeah.
56. And so that's very real. It's very much alive
Mhm.
there still. You just walk down the streets and you feel the weight of all of that history. And I think that is a part then of the music making too. People have a seriousness, like you've mentioned about Eva. There's a real obligation to connecting with the truth of the music and communicating that. And I think that's the wonderful thing about a lot of Hungarian musicians is that, and they also realized through communism, someone like Eva, that this was a way out. This was something that they could do that could open up the bigger world to them. And so, but interpretively, I sense a kind of depth a lot of times. And even people like Anne-Sophie van Otter, one of her main teachers that she credits was a Hungarian singer who she said she was in London studying, and this teacher had also moved there after everything had
Was that
happened.
Vera Roja?
Yes, yeah.
ROSGA?
Yes, and she says that that's the teacher that pushed her to put more of herself in the music, more in the interpretation, and I think that's true. I find that with whether it's instrumental or vocal, a lot of times you feel a kind of honesty about the music making, which I really respect.
Vera Roja taught Anne-Sophie van Otter, Kiri Takano, and Karita Matila.
Mhm.
So that's a lot to be grateful for. I
The
had an
legacy.
uncle who was born in Budapest in 1908, and he died in 2010 at the age of 102.
Wow.
So he had a memory of everything, and they were dirt poor. He came to New York in 1916 and found his way to the Metropolitan Opera House as an 8-year-old with his older brother and sister. And they stood in the standing room. They did not have shoes. And to them, it was more important to be barefoot, but to hear opera at the Metropolitan Opera House all the way up, and that was America to them.
Yeah.
And that they were able to experience this. My uncle heard Caruso and Rosa Ponzel. By the time he heard Ponzel, he had shoes. But it was remarkable the kind of history that he could recount to me. He never lost his Hungarian accent. He never lost his sense of humor. But he also had very strong feelings about Hungary. I do too, in a way. I got to live and work there in the autumn of 1998.
Okay.
And it was a really kind of fascinating experience, in part because my uncle was still around and told me things, but also because it is such a rich, contradictory culture, I think I can say, but so deep and fascinating.
And there's a real appreciation for culture just among everybody there. So it's one of the reasons I chose to go to Budapest to do the Fulbright, is that there was a real preference for people who wanted to delve into this kind of cultural learning. And there are streets named after the composers there and conductors. You know, they're just revered. And when I moved there, I went to go get a cell phone. And the woman on the other side, you know, at the T-Mobile or whatever it was going through the questions, and she asked what I do for a living, a common question that they would ask. And I said, I'm an opera singer. She stopped everything and just started staring at me with the sort of the most awe and wonder, like she just couldn't believe it, you know. And she couldn't bring herself back to finishing her little contract because she was so, you know, in awe of the fact that I would sing opera. And I just feel like you don't get that everywhere, you know, that kind of understanding or appreciation for it.
I didn't know when we began our conversation we'd be speaking about Hungary, but I'm glad we are, because I've not discussed Hungary with anyone else on my previous programs here. But the first time I went there it's now Easter right now, was Easter of 1976. I was a teenager and I was traveling with two friends. We were all teenagers, a boy and a girl. And we stayed at a pension that we were referred to at the railway station. I remember the man said with a sort of Dracula accent, "It is not easy to come by accommodations behind the Iron Curtain." And he placed a call to a woman whose name was Marton, like Eva Marton, Szili, Szili, because in Hungary they list their last name first. So when I met Eva, she stuck her hand out to me and said, "Marton Eva." And I said, "Plotkin Fred," you know. But Marton Szili did not speak a word of anything apart from Hungarian. She was very concerned about the sleeping arrangements because she didn't want the two boys together, but she didn't want either of the boys with the girl. Mm-hmm. So I had to sleep on the floor and she would check on us. But she would ask us, well, we married by holding her finger up and point at where the ring would be. But somehow she didn't have any money. And although I was a student, a teenager, I figured out if I went to the Central Market with Marton Silly and I bought the foods that she indicated, I asked her to teach me how to make goulash and strudel
Oh,
and
great.
use paprika in the different ways, because there's the rose paprika and the hot paprika and so on.
Yeah.
And she taught, we spent about 12 hours with me learning from her the fundamentals of Hungarian cooking. It was thrilling.
Okay.
And that's like having a Fulbright.
Yeah, so when we
And
have our bikaver, you're also going to cook some goulash? Is that what I'm
yeah,
hearing?
I could do that. Yeah. I could do that.
Good.
And I'll tell you about working the paprika harvest in 1998, but that's for another time. Um, you, when I asked you to provide me with some recommendations from the Adagio catalog, of things that you like, you had a wonderful list that will be attached to this interview when people go to see it. And you mentioned yourself that many of them were mezzos or a woman playing a cello, which
Uh-huh.
is like the mezzo of stringed instruments. Was it the sound that you went for first? Was it the particular artist, among them Lorraine Hunt Lieberson and Sophie von Otter, Bernarda Fink, plus Jacqueline Dupre playing her cello?
Mhm.
What led to your selections?
It's what we were talking about a little bit about this sort of Hungarian, this depth of honesty, vulnerability, emotion that comes through. I feel there's real honesty in all of those performers' interpretations, and that's what I connect with. Below the words and the phrasing and all of that other technical stuff, there's just a real truth I find in all of those performers in the way that they connect with the music and they bring it to life. And so that, and it's also a little bit on the deeper, maybe the sadder emotions. I think that I mean, someone like Anne-Sophie von Otter certainly was wonderful with coloratura, obviously, but it was the lyrical singing and this sort of deeper sad emotions that drew me into their artistry. And also David Daniels, who's not on that list, but I remember, but should be. I remember listening to certain songs of his just on constant loop because I was so moved by them. I just wanted to live in that space of the music that he was giving me and the truth that he was conveying, you know. So just listen to this three
So
minute
I
song on loop.
just thought of something. Lorraine Hunt Lieberson and Sophie von Otter, um, great Octavians. Now, if you were to shave your beard,
Yeah, I
would
mean,
you
in the right
ever
context, sure.
consider playing Octavian? You mentioned Cherubino, who was like the great grandfather of Octavian.
Carabino's rough for me because I don't look like a 16-year-old boy.
No.
You know, it would be hard for me to convey that. I can sing it. It wouldn't be a problem to vocally do it. Octavian's maybe more in the category of what could be believable, and also vocally, I love singing big lyrical things. When I was younger, I used to sing Strauss songs. You know, I didn't think anything of that. I'd go into an audition and I'd offer a Strauss song along with my Handel arias because it just felt good. You know, it felt good
Mhm.
for me to be singing that way. So it's not out of the realm of possibility. It'd have to be the right
Even in a
production.
concert version or highlights, we could leave out all the waltzes.
Sure. I mean, anything is happening now in concert, right?
Yeah.
With the Carmen that just happened in Chicago with Stephanie singing Don Jose, and
Stephanie Blythe, Don
so
Jose, Jamie Barton, Carmen. Yes.
yeah. So we can do these things. Sure, I'd love to.
I think so. No, I mean, I that would be something I'd love to hear you sing. Now, the other person you mentioned, I think the world of, and I wrote to her, Bernarda Fink, and want her to be on this program. I haven't had an answer. So if you ever run into Bernarda Fink, tell her that I really do think the world of her and want her on this program. Why Bernarda Fink singing Schubert, by the way?
Same. I mean, I just think that her interpretations, there's such honesty and truth in it. It's about a perfect balance of technique and emotion. You know, it meets in that beautiful place where, and with something like Schubert, the like Nacht und Träume or these that they just require such a vulnerability, and I feel like she really brings that to that repertoire and everything she did. You know, there's just such integrity there.
So you are at your home in Boston, but you are flying out very soon to go to Munich
Mhm.
and start on a new project by a living composer.
Mhm.
Would you tell me about that and the listeners? And I want to know about creating a new role, about
Sure.
everything involved, and frankly, working with a living composer.
Sure. So this is by a composer named Georg Friedrich Haas. The opera is called Thomas, and it's an in-depth exploration of dying, basically. The opera opens with a man in a hospital bed who has labored breathing, and his partner is there going through the emotions that you would go through, knowing that this is the end of the life of your partner, and there's nothing you can do about that. And I play the character of Michael, who the composer likens to sort of the archangel Michael, that he is this
Mhm.
sort of conduit between worlds almost. And so I am there to comfort the partner who's not ill, and to we
Are these two men the partners?
yes, yeah.
I'm asking in terms of the distribution of the voices.
There's
What
a
voice is Thomas and what voice is the partner? We know what Michael is.
So yeah, the Thomas is a bass baritone, and the other partner basically. There's one scene where he sings kind of baritone, and but mainly he's just labored breathing through the whole thing. It's very, very contemporary. I have had a love-hate relationship with working on this particular opera because it has required of me an entirely new way of working. Basically, it's microtonal, so there are quarter tones and sixth tones, so that I've had to find a way to work into my voice and to hear. The sixth tone is so small; it's hard to even like the
Could
vibrato that
you,
we sing
for
with.
people who are not musicologists, describe a sixth tone? Because it's new, even
Sure.
it's not new to me, but I'm not at home with it.
Yeah, so we have in Western music a system of composing that's based on an octave, which is broken down into whole steps or half steps, and there are 8 of them in an octave, right? And that's usually what makes up a scale, which is the basis of everything that Western composers use as a foundation for their composing. Other modes of music, like Indian music, and they work in a different system. Some Asian music, where there's the tone itself is not broken down into 2 increments, which is what we have if you have a half step or a whole step in Western music, but it's broken down in smaller increments. Usually a fourth of a tone can be broken down into 4 small steps, or in the case of a 6 tone, 6 small steps. And it goes even further. You can have 12th tones and that sort
Yeah.
of thing too. But so it's just an entirely different way of structuring the musical composition. And as someone who has trained in this Western tradition, it's been very challenging, to be quite honest, to understand first of all and then work that into the voice, but it gets there. And I do understand why the composer is doing this. He just wants a completely different sort of soundscape for this theme that he's composing the opera on. And I think it's going to be interesting to see it all come together, because I can see a piece of it that I'm working on, but the way he imagines the whole thing, it all connects. So all the singers sort of have to be in the same room in order to really get what's happening. And I don't think that's always the case with other composers, Puccini or someone. You can get a sense on your own exactly of what's going on. But the parts are so closely interwoven, and the orchestration is all plucked instruments, also tuned microtonally. So there's a couple different zithers, cembalo,
So when
and
you say
accordion.
microtonally, what do you mean microtonally?
They're tuned in these different scales, not in a Western scale. And we never have a pitch that's doubled in the orchestration.
Hmm.
So finding the way to learn the music, and you just can never trust that, oh, I'm going to hear my pitch right there before I come in, which you often will hear in other types of music. So that's been a challenge in and of itself. The parts are so connected that this baritone, Thomas, will sing, and then I come out of his vocal line a half step or some random tritone or interval or something. I'm getting very technical about it, but
Hmm.
Anyway, all of this is just to serve the theme of what the composer wants to communicate, which is this death. And he wants to create a feeling for the audience of weight. And I think it will be very effective.
Is it in German?
In German, yes.
And did Haas write the libretto or someone else wrote the libretto?
Different. He
Okay.
has a librettist that he works with for several things. And there actually is at the Bayerische Staatsoper, and they were meant to present 3 of his operas as kind of a little triptych. And one of them was canceled about a month ago because the orchestra was from Russia. And so all of this Russia-Ukraine has affected the cultural landscape. And the half of the score had to be completely memorized by the orchestra because they play in complete darkness. And there wasn't time for another orchestra to learn the part adequately, so they had to cancel one of them. But there'll be two operas by this composer if you.
So a diptych.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Have you already communicated with Haas, and have you begun to ask him about ideas, or will that happen in rehearsal?
I think in rehearsal. There's a documentary about him. He's a very interesting person. He was in residence at Columbia University.
I know.
And yeah, so, and apparently he's also he's in sort of the BDSM world, and he's very open about that. And there's a big article about him in the New York Times going into all of that. And
I read that. I mean, I didn't know about that. So let's define BDSM in the most PG rated way. It is for people, it is an interest in the pursuit of people who pursue sexual and other practices that may involve violence or domination, or among consenting adults, I should say. And it startled me because I had never really, I knew that he was at Columbia. I met him once because I lived near Columbia and I studied at Columbia University. But I didn't know that background about him and his wife, who is the other participant in this. And it sort of stunned me when I read the article in the New York Times, not because my feelings one way or another. My feeling is, as they say in Yiddish, "Geh gesinnt," go do what you want. You should live and be well. And if people are consenting, it's not ever up to me to judge or even have an opinion about what they do. I guess what struck me was that anyone who would look up that composer, and the first thing that comes up is not about his music, but about his sexual practices, it has a way of blocking me from getting at the music, so to speak.
Yeah, I think a lot of reviewers in Vienna and other places in Europe comment on it and say, yeah, okay, so that's a part of it, but doesn't really affect the music. The music is its own thing and it stands on its own for them. But I do have to say, when I was learning this, I was just trying to find the way in, and I couldn't use any of the tools that I am used to delving into when I start to learn a role. And it was very frustrating. And I thought, maybe if I understand something more about this aspect of him and how that might connect with him as a composer and what he might have infused of that in the score somehow, maybe I can find a way in to connect with the role. So I watched a documentary about him that's out there and goes into detail about all of this. But then I ultimately decided that they were separate, that it is a part of who he is, but it's not necessarily a part of who he is as a composer. I'll ask him when I meet him and see if there are bigger connections there. But
so there's a lyric, I believe it's in Verdi's Ernani, "Ogni cor serba un mistero." Every heart harbors a mystery.
Yeah.
And I'm not seeking your opinion, though you can venture yours, but my opinion is a lot of times mystery is an important thing for the creative artists. And we don't necessarily have to put every single thing out there, because then that comes to define us, and for some people alienate from us or whatever. Whereas my feeling is, as I just said, if someone wants to do whatever they want to do, if they're consenting adults and no one is unwillingly harmed, fine. But I think that mystery for the creative person, whatever he or she does, they do, is an important element to keep something behind. If I read a poem, I don't need to know the whole biography of the poet. I need to know what the poet has produced.
I think an artist has to always be honest, as I've said many times, but that doesn't mean that you have to reveal everything about yourself. You can choose not to reveal aspects, but still be honest. And I think with the composer Haas, if this is a part of his path to understanding himself and to communicating what he feels is honest, then I think it's important for him in his artistic journey to be open about that. But and definitely if it's just evolving himself as a person in some way, then that evolves him as an artist too. And so like you said, I would never judge it, but at the same time, it's you communicate what you feel comfortable communicating.
I always want the art to speak for itself. I sort of feel as the creative person that it's my job to create it, to bring everything from within me that I can to it. But unless I'm writing a memoir, it's not about me. It's about something that happens in the journey to create that work of art that then doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to the audience, to the reader, to the consumer, to whoever receives the work of art that I'm creating or you're creating. It's no longer mine. And yes.
No, I think that's fair. I mean, that is art. Like, it has to stand alone, and we have to imbue it with these aspects of ourselves, but then let it go and let people connect with it in the way that they connect with it, and hopefully understand some of that truth that you've put into it, but we can't control that.
So we do need to wind up, just because unfortunately technology is not perfect and delayed our start. But I wanted to ask you about something else. You spent a great deal of time in London at the Royal College of Music. You've sung a lot in London. You are aware of the British musical scene. You participated in a BBC documentary called Mozart's London Odyssey. Talk about that.
Yeah, it was about the castrato singer Giovanni Manzuoli and Mozart, who, when he was 6, 7 years old, came to London with his father, and he first met this castrato then, and they just became good friends. And the castrato taught Mozart aspects of how to sing, and they just kept in touch throughout their whole lives. And Mozart eventually wrote roles for him in Ascanio and Alba, I think, and a couple of operas. At that point, his voice had lowered. He was a high soprano when Manzuoli was performing in London, and he was hugely famous castrato who just was the talk of the town for a couple of seasons. And then he went back to Italy, and his voice had dropped to a contralto range, and that's when Mozart then wrote roles for him when he was a little bit older. But the documentary was just about that, and I sang a piece by Johann Christian Bach, who also lived in London and was composing and was a part of this whole circle. He connected with Mozart and Manzuoli. And so I speak about that, and I tie in the performing and the research, which is what I really love to do when I'm able to bring both of those aspects together. And so that's out there.
So I think that in the hour we spent, I've learned a phenomenal amount, for which I'm grateful for, because I know a lot of stuff, but when I meet someone like you who teaches me a great deal, I feel younger. I feel terrific as a result.
Glad I could give that to you.
No, it's very helpful. It's like, youth potion. I'm not old, I'm not saying that, but there's something about learning and about exploring areas that I have some familiarity with, but going much deeper with someone who's very expert, that I greatly appreciate. So we look forward, wherever we are in the world, to hear you perform. And I envision also you being quite a teacher and scholar, and that role as well.
I would love it if that's obviously eventually what happens.
But it seems to be a great passion for you.
Very much.
That goes well beyond the American stereotype of the tall guy from Colorado.
Thank you.
Who arm wrestle with Eva Marton and lost nobly, but
Apparently, she used to throw shot put. I heard that at
yeah,
one
she
point when
did.
she was younger.
Well, Ava in 1960 was a member, probably the captain, of the Hungarian Olympic gold medal winning volleyball team for Hungary 1960.
Oh, nothing surprises me about her. That's
So the woman can spike. There's
yeah.
nothing Eva Marton. Maybe I'm a slightly better cook, but there's nothing Eva Marton can't do if she puts her
Truth.
mind to it.
Yeah.
And I'm thrilled, in fact, to know that you had such a meaningful experience with her, because I've never met anyone before who studied with Eva Marton, and because she's someone that I really got to know very, very well. Um, I think the world of her, and I'm just so happy, especially because I would never picture her teaching a countertenor,
Yeah.
because it's not her music, so to
You know
speak.
what it was this connection in musicality. She saw that I was an artist beyond being a countertenor, and she connected with that aspect of my music making, and she was interested in working with and exploring that. If it was just that I'm a countertenor and it's something that was it, I don't think that she would have been interested, but she sensed something deeper there.
So, Randall Scotting, thank you. I look forward to actually meeting you one day in person and hearing you perform again. And we don't say the famous words of good luck to a singer. We say "toi toi toi"
Mhm.
for your next adventure in Munich.
Thank you.
And we look forward, wherever we are in the world, if listeners, because many are in Germany, are in or near Munich in the coming period, do go there and hear this new opera,
Thank you. It's
which
been a
is
pleasure.
called Thomas, which is the name
Thomas.
of the character in the bed. Thomas,
Yep.
Thomas.
The character who's not in the bed, the living partner who's not
Oh,
ill.
that's Thomas. What's the
Yeah.
name of the guy in the bed? Johnny Skiki?
Matthias. Oh, right. I have stories about that too, but we don't have time. As a
Well, no,
countertenor,
that
I
one is
had
good.
to.
It would be Bozo Donati, not
You're
Johnny
right.
Skiki.
Right.
Bozo Donati.
You're right.
A role that I've played.
Me too. That's
Yeah,
as a countertenor in college. No one knew what to do with me in Indiana, where I was studying in
yeah.
Butler University. So to get my opera credit, which you had to have in order to get the degree, I had to be in an opera, and so they assigned me to play the dead guy in Johnny Skiki. So I got thrown in a trunk and then spent the whole opera there, and then I was able to graduate.
My skill in playing that role was that I didn't break out in laughter, because you cannot have a laughing corpse.
No, and a lot of funny things happen in that opera for sure.
Absolutely. I just had to keep a very straight face and shut eyes the whole time and pretend not to know what was going on around. I couldn't pull the sheets over my head, nothing.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Randall.
Great.
And
Thank you.
to be continued. All
Let's
best.
do it again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.